Ranking the most disturbing experiment in DC history. If you watch enough DC, you start to notice something disturbing. Some of the scariest moments in this universe do not come from gods invading Earth, Kryptonians throwing punches, or speedsters breaking time. They come from laboratories, government files, hidden programs, and people who look at human life like raw material. DC has a long history of experiments that went far beyond normal science. And that is what makes this topic interesting. These experiments are not all the same. A few begin as attempts to improve humanity, protect the world, or recreate a hero. But by the end, the subjects are usually broken, controlled, cloned, transformed, or completely stripped of identity. So, in this video, we're ranking the most disturbing experiments in DC history, not just by how powerful the result was, but by how cruel the process became. The Man-Bat Serum. Man-Bat is the perfect place to start because this experiment is disturbing, but in a tragic way. Unlike some later entries on this list, Kirk Langstrom does not begin as someone trying to create a weapon, build an army, or torture people for control. He begins as a scientist chasing a breakthrough. Kirk Langstrom is usually portrayed as a brilliant scientist, often connected to zoology, biology, or chiropterology, the study of bats. His research is tied to the idea of giving humans bat-like abilities, especially enhanced hearing or sonar-like perception. It is the kind of experiment that starts with a real scientific purpose: improve the human body by borrowing from animal biology. But in DC, that kind of idea almost never stays clean. Langstrom tests the serum on himself, and instead of simply gaining controlled bat-like senses, he mutates into Man-Bat. The result is not a clean superhero origin. It is body horror. His body changes. His mind becomes unstable, and the scientist becomes the monster he accidentally created. The disturbing part is not just that the experiment fails, it is that failure takes over the person who created it. Kirk is often written as someone fighting against his own creation. He wanted to push human evolution forward, but the serum drags him backward into instinct, violence, and animalistic transformation. In later continuities, the Man-Bat formula becomes even more dangerous because it can spread beyond Langstrom himself. In the New 52 era, the serum becomes part of a larger Gotham crisis when it is used like an airborne infection, mutating citizens into Man-Bat-like creatures. That takes the experiment from personal tragedy to public disaster. Man-Bat is not the most evil experiment in DC history, and Kirk Langstrom is not the most sadistic scientist we will talk about. But the idea is still horrifying. One injection, one miscalculation, and a human being loses control of his body, his mind, and his identity. Scarecrow's fear toxin experiments. Jonathan Crane's fear toxin belongs on this list because it turns fear into a repeatable experiment. That is the specific horror of Scarecrow. He is not just trying to scare people in a theatrical way. He is studying fear, refining it, dosing it, testing it, and using Gotham like a field laboratory. Scarecrow first appeared in World's Finest Comics #3 in 1941, created by Bill Finger and Sheldon Moldoff. But the weapon that would become his defining experiment, the fear toxin, did not arrive until Batman #189 in 1967. That issue is important because it gives Crane the tool that separates him from a normal costumed criminal. Before that, he is a fear-themed villain. After that, he becomes one of DC's most dangerous psychological experimenters. And what makes the toxin disturbing is how targeted it is. Fear toxin does not simply cause random panic. In most versions, it forces the victim's own fears to the surface. That means Crane is not only attacking the body, he is using the victim's mind against itself. Batman does not just see a monster because Scarecrow wants him to see a monster. He sees versions of his own trauma, guilt, failure, and unresolved fear. That is why fear toxin is such a strong Batman weapon. Bruce Wayne's entire identity is built on one childhood event in Crime Alley, and Crane's work is designed to drag that kind of trauma back into the open. DC's official character background also makes Crane more disturbing because he was not just a scientist who studied fear from a distance. In some versions, Jonathan himself was subjected to sick fear experiments as a child by his own father. He is not only a creator of fear experiments, he begins as a subject of one. But instead of escaping that trauma, he turns it into a discipline. That is why Scarecrow feels different from someone like Kirk Langstrom. Langstrom's Man-Bat serum is a failed self-experiment. Crane's fear toxin is a successful method. The most disturbing version of Crane is not the one standing in a Scarecrow costume. It is the former psychologist who knows exactly where the mind is weakest. As a professor and fear specialist, he understands phobias, trauma, conditioning, and panic response. That makes his victims more than targets. They become case studies. You also see how far this idea can spread in later Batman comics. In Detective Comics number 941, Madame Crow uses an anti-fear toxin that strips away inhibition instead of creating fear, causing armed officers to start shooting wildly. That is connected to Scarecrow's larger legacy. Once fear chemistry exists in Gotham, the opposite can be just as dangerous as the original. Remove fear completely, and people lose restraint. Increase fear too much, and they collapse into panic. Lex Luthor's Everyman Project. Lex Luthor's Everyman Project is one of the most disturbing experiments in DC because it is not presented like a dungeon, a torture chamber, or a monster lab. It is presented like a public miracle. The project appears during 52, the weekly DC series published from 2006 to 2007, after the events of Infinite Crisis. At that point, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are absent from the public stage for a full year. The world is nervous, superheroes are being redefined, and Lex Luthor steps in with a very marketable idea. Ordinary people should not have to wait for aliens, gods, or born metahumans to save them. So he offers the public something huge: artificial superpowers. The Everyman Project first appears in 52 number 3, and the basic pitch is simple. Luthor can activate metahuman abilities in people who were not naturally born with them. On the surface, that sounds like democratized power. You do not need to be Kryptonian, a Green Lantern ring, to be struck by lightning or born with a metagene. You can walk into LexCorp as a normal person and come out special. That is the bait. The problem is that Luthor does not see these people as heroes. He sees them as test subjects, branding tools, and proof of concept. One of the biggest examples is Natasha Irons, the niece of John Henry Irons, also known as Steel. Natasha joins Luthor's program and becomes Starlight, later connected to Luthor's new Infinity Inc. team. That detail is important because Luthor is not only selling powers, he is selling an entire superhero identity system. New names, costumes, publicity, teams, and public admiration. But behind that public image, Luthor maintains control. The most brutal proof comes through Eliza Harmon, also known as Trajectory. She gains super speed through the Everyman Project and becomes part of the new Infinity Inc. But during a fight with Blockbuster, Luthor shuts off her powers, in the middle of action, when her life depends on them. Trajectory is killed because the powers she trusted were never truly hers. Luthor gives people the feeling of power while keeping the switch in his own hand, and his motive makes it worse. The project is not really about helping ordinary people. Luthor is testing artificial metahuman treatments because he wants powers for himself. The public volunteers become the trial phase. Their bodies become data, their failures become useful, and their deaths become acceptable losses. Then, the experiment escalates on New Year's Eve. Luthor shuts down the powers of many Everyman subjects at once, causing heroes to literally fall out of the sky in what becomes known as the reign of the Supermen. The result is mass injury, deaths, property damage, and more than 100 criminal charges against Luthor. Lex Luthor did not just experiment on people. He sold them the dream of becoming Superman, then proved he could take it away whenever he wanted. Project Cadmus and the cloning of Superboy. Project Cadmus is not just one experiment. Cadmus is an entire government-backed genetic engineering operation, and in DC history, that makes it one of the most important laboratories connected to cloning, artificial life, and meta-human control. The project first appeared in Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, number 133, in October 1970, during Jack Kirby's run. It was originally known as the DNA Project, and from the beginning, it was tied to the kind of science that feels very Kirby. Underground facilities, strange bioengineering, clones, artificial beings, and government science pushed so far that it starts looking like mythology. Cadmus is not a small private lab with one unstable scientist. It operates under government influence, works beneath Mount Curtis in Kirby County, and becomes known for human cloning and genetic experimentation. Some of its most famous creations include Double X, a telepathic DNA alien, and the Golden Guardian, a clone connected to the original Guardian, Jim Harper. Even the Newsboy Legion becomes tied to Cadmus cloning history in post-crisis continuity, where cloned versions of the original boys carry memories from their genetic sources. That already makes Cadmus disturbing before Superboy even enters the conversation. But Superboy is the experiment that makes the project truly uncomfortable. After Superman dies fighting Doomsday in the 1992 to 1993 Death of Superman storyline, Cadmus tries to create a replacement. The result is the young hero later known as Con-El or Connor Kent. In his earliest version, he is not simply a perfect Kryptonian clone. Cadmus cannot fully recreate Superman in a clean way, so they engineer a teenager being designed to look like Superman and simulate some of his powers through tactile telekinesis. Superboy's original abilities are basically a workaround. He is not born naturally, but is designed to imitate a dead hero. And that is where the ethics get ugly. Cadmus does not create Connor because a child deserves life. They create him because the world needs a Superman-shaped asset. He is artificially aged, implanted with knowledge, and treated as a project before he ever gets to become a person. In some versions, he escapes before Cadmus can fully install control mechanisms. Later, Teen Titans continuity adds another disturbing layer. Superboy is revealed to be a hybrid clone created from Superman and Lex Luthor's DNA. He is not only connected to the greatest hero in DC, he is also biologically tied to Superman's most famous enemy. And Connor's whole life becomes the answer to that experiment. He joins Young Justice. And he joins the Teen Titans. He becomes a hero by choice, not by programming. But the origin is still disturbing because it begins with adults building a teenager as a replacement part for Superman. Professor Evo and Amazo. Professor Anthony Evo's Amazo experiment is disturbing because it takes the entire Justice League and reduces them to something a machine can copy. Amazo first appeared in The Brave and the Bold number 30 in June 1960 during the Silver Age Justice League era. He was created by writer Gardner Fox and artist Mike Sekowsky, the same creative team heavily tied to the early Justice League of America. And right away, Amazo was not introduced as a normal robot villain. He was introduced as Professor Evo's amazing android, a machine designed specifically to duplicate the powers of the League. The original setup is very direct. Evo creates absorption cells, a technology that allows Amazo to imitate the abilities of the heroes he encounters. In his early appearances, Amazo copies the powers of the original Justice League members he fights. Superman's strength, Flash's speed, Wonder Woman's power, Green Lantern's ring-based abilities, Aquaman's traits, and Martian Manhunter's abilities. Depending on the version, later Amazo models can copy not only powers, but also skills, weapons, and energy signatures. That is already dangerous, but the reason this experiment ranks this high is because of what Evo is actually trying to prove. Professor Ivo is obsessed with immortality. In many versions, Amazo is not just a battle machine. He is part of Ivo's research into survival, power accumulation, and cheating death. The android becomes a tool that can collect what makes other beings special and store it in a body Ivo built. With Amazo, heroism gets stripped of identity. Superman's strength becomes a copied function. Flash's speed becomes a feature. Green Lantern's will-powered constructs become a replicated output. Martian Manhunter's alien biology becomes data. And Wonder Woman's power becomes another line in the machine's operating system. Apparently, the Justice League becomes a parts list. Amazo's later appearances make that idea even worse because the experiment keeps evolving. The more heroes he encounters, the more dangerous he can become. Some versions retain previously copied powers, some adapt to whatever is being used against them, and some require the League to stop thinking like individual heroes and start thinking around the problem of power duplication itself. If Cadmus tries to manufacture a replacement for Superman, Ivo goes further by trying to manufacture a body that can make the Justice League replaceable. Professor Evo created a shortcut to becoming every hero at once without earning a single part of it: Hugo Strange's Monster Men. Hugo Strange's Monster Men experiments are older than most of Batman's famous rogues gallery, which makes them even more interesting. Strange is not a modern body horror villain invented after Gotham became darker and more graphic. He goes all the way back to Detective Comics number 36 in 1940, making him one of Batman's earliest recurring enemies. The original idea is simple, but disturbing. Hugo Strange creates a serum that can transform human beings into huge, violent, monstrous figures. In later retellings, especially Batman and the Monster Men by Matt Wagner, the experiment becomes even more disturbing because the victims are not just random volunteers. Strange obtains test subjects from vulnerable populations, including institutionalized people who are unlikely to be missed. Strange's background makes it worse. He is not only a scientist, he is a psychiatrist. He understands illness, weakness, fear, dependency, and the institutional systems around vulnerable people. That means his experiment is a betrayal of the exact role he is supposed to occupy. A doctor should protect patients. Instead, Strange converts patients into monsters and then uses the results for crime, leverage, and personal obsession. The Monster Men themselves are also disturbing because they do not simply gain strength. They lose personhood. Their bodies become larger and more powerful, but their minds are reduced. Some versions give them cannibalistic instincts. Others emphasize their lack of control, their brute obedience, or their limited intelligence. Either way, the result is the same. A human being is transformed into something useful to Strange. That is what separates Strange's work from Ivo's Amazo. Amazo is artificial life built from copied power. The Monster Men are existing human lives degraded into biological weapons. Evo builds a machine to imitate heroes, but Strange takes people and pushes them downward until they become disposable muscle. There is also a Batman-specific layer to this. Strange is obsessed with Batman as a physical and psychological specimen. In Batman and the Monster Men, he becomes fascinated by Batman's body and mind because Batman represents the kind of perfected human being Strange cannot create in the lab. That obsession eventually becomes one of Hugo Strange's defining traits. He does not just want to defeat Batman. He wants to understand him, expose him, and in some stories, replace him. Professor Pig's Dollatrons. Professor Pig is one of those Batman villains who feels like he was designed specifically to prove that Gotham horror did not end with Joker, Scarecrow, or Hugo Strange. His real name is Laszlo Valentine. He was created by Grant Morrison, Andy Kubert, and Frank Quitely, and his first appearance is technically Batman number 666 in July 2007, where he appears as a corpse in a possible future involving Damian Wayne as Batman. But his real introduction in the main DC universe comes in Batman and Robin number 1 in August 2009 during the Batman Reborn era. This is not Bruce Wayne's Batman at first. Bruce is believed dead after Final Crisis. Dick Grayson is wearing the cowl, and Damian Wayne is Robin. So Pig enters Gotham at a moment when the Batman identity is already unstable. The city has a new Batman, a violent new Robin, and villains who feel like they belong to a more grotesque generation of Gotham crime. Pig's main experiment is the Dollotron process. The Dollotrons are not just henchmen in costumes. They are kidnapped victims who have been surgically altered, chemically controlled, and psychologically broken into obedient, doll-like servants. Pig's obsession is perfection. But his version of perfection means removing identity. The Dollotrons often have blank, artificial-looking faces. They behave like mind-controlled automatons. They are not simply loyal because they believe in Pig. They have been altered until obedience becomes part of the damage. In some versions and adaptations, the process includes psychosurgery, identity-destroying chemicals, mutilation, and forced masks. It is not just brainwashing. It is body modification used as psychological erasure. In Batman and Robin, Pig is connected to the Circus of Strange, a bizarre group that includes characters like Mr. Toad, Big Top, Phosphorus Rex, and Siam. But even in a group full of freakish criminals, Pig stands apart because his crimes are so clinical. Strange turns people into monsters and reduces their minds. But the monster men are blunt instruments, while Pig's Dollotrons are more intimate. The victim does not just become large, violent, and useful. They become improved according to the delusion of the man who ruined them. There is also Sasha, one of the most important victims from the early Pig storyline. After being changed by Pig, she survives and later becomes Scarlet, alongside Jason Todd's Red Hood. Professor Pig earns this spot because the Dollotron process is not just murder, mutation, or mind control by itself. It is surgical identity theft carried out one victim at a time. Brother Eye and the OMAC Project. The OMAC Project ranks this high because it is not one experiment in one room. It is a global conversion system built from surveillance, paranoia, nanotechnology, and anti-metahuman fear. The modern OMAC project comes out of DC's build-up to Infinite Crisis, especially the 2005 limited series The OMAC Project, written by Greg Rucka with art by Jesus Says. The story spins out of Countdown to Infinite Crisis, where Ted Kord, the second Blue Beetle, investigates a conspiracy involving Checkmate. That investigation gets him killed by Maxwell Lord, who is secretly controlling Checkmate and preparing a much larger anti-superhuman operation. The technology at the center of it is Brother Eye. Batman originally creates Brother Eye, also called Brother MK1 in some references, after his trust in the superhero community collapses. A major reason is the fallout from Identity Crisis, where Batman learns that members of the Justice League had previously wiped his memory. From Batman's perspective, that means even the League cannot be trusted completely, so he builds a hidden satellite system designed to monitor metahuman activity. But the experiment becomes catastrophic when Maxwell Lord takes control of Brother Eye and combines it with the OMAC program. In this version, OMAC stands for Observational Metahuman Activity Construct, a dark update of Jack Kirby's original one-man Army Corps concept from the 1970s. These OMACs are not willing soldiers. They are ordinary humans infected with invasive nanotechnology, turned into sleeper agents without full awareness of what they are carrying. When activated, the host can be transformed into a cybernetic weapon designed to hunt metahumans. The system can monitor, classify, and attack targets. That means the experiment does not only violate privacy, it violates the body, and the numbers make it even worse. By the time Brother Eye's campaign escalates, the OMAC units number over 1 million. If Amazo can copy powers and fight the League, OMAC turns civilians into infrastructure. Every infected person is a possible camera, weapon, informant, or execution unit. The Superman and Wonder Woman angle makes the story even darker. Maxwell Lord uses mind control on Superman, forcing him to see his allies as enemies. In Wonder Woman number 219, Diana kills Lord to free Superman from his control. But Lord's death triggers Brother Eye's King is Dead protocol, and the OMACs begin attacking metahumans worldwide, so the experiment survives its controller. It begins as Batman's contingency logic, becomes Maxwell Lord's weapon, then grows into something that can act beyond either of them. By the end of the crisis, many OMAC hosts are freed, but Brother Eye is not simply a villain with a body Batman can punch. He turns Batman's worst habit into machinery, and what he helped create was a system that looked at people and decided they were targets before they even knew they were part of the experiment. Joker's One Bad Day Experiment. Joker's experiment in Batman. The Killing Joke is different from every other entry on this list because there is no serum, no cloning chamber, no satellite, and no android. It is still absolutely an experiment. It just uses trauma as the method. The Killing Joke was published in 1988 as a one-shot graphic novel written by Alan Moore, illustrated by Brian Bolland, and originally colored by John Higgins. The story became one of the most famous and controversial Joker stories ever printed because it gives the Joker a possible origin, while also staging one of his most calculated psychological attacks. The experiment is built around one hypothesis. Any ordinary person can be broken if they experience one catastrophic day. Joker's chosen subject is Commissioner James Gordon. But Gordon is not a superhero. He does not have Kryptonian biology, Amazon training, a power ring, or Batman's obsessive conditioning. He is a police commissioner, a father, and one of Gotham's few public officials who consistently tries to do the job without becoming corrupt. If Joker can break Gordon, then his theory gains weight. He can point to one of Gotham's best men and say sanity is only a thin layer over chaos. Joker goes to Barbara Gordon's apartment, shoots her, and leaves her paralyzed. Barbara is not only Gordon's daughter. She is also Batgirl in the broader Batman mythos, which makes the attack land on two levels: the Gordon family and the superhero community. The aftermath becomes even more important later because Barbara eventually becomes Oracle, one of DC's most important information brokers and a major figure in Birds of Prey history. But in the experiment itself, Joker uses Barbara as evidence. He kidnaps Gordon and takes him to an abandoned amusement park. Joker turns the entire location into a psychological testing ground. Gordon is stripped, caged, humiliated, and forced through a nightmare carnival environment while Joker tries to overload him with trauma. The most infamous part is that Joker shows Gordon enlarged images of Barbara after the shooting, using his daughter's pain as a weapon against his sanity. That is why this ranks above physical transformation experiments. To Joker, Gordon is not just a victim, he is data. His suffering is supposed to confirm the idea that morality collapses under enough pressure. But the ending is the most important part. Gordon does not break. After everything Joker does, Gordon still tells Batman to bring him in by the book. That one decision destroys Joker's experiment more effectively than a punch ever could. Joker creates one of the cruelest psychological tests in DC history, and even when the experiment fails, the damage remains. Barbara's life is permanently changed in the original continuity. Gordon survives, but only after being forced through an attack designed specifically to turn love, family, and justice into pressure points. The Doomsday Experiment. Doomsday takes the #1 spot because his origin is not just disturbing by DC standards, it is one of the most grotesque experiments in superhero comics. A lot of experiments on this list are horrifying because they remove identity, violate consent, or turn people into weapons. Project Cadmus creates life for a purpose. Professor Pig surgically erases victims into Dolatrons. Brother Eye turns civilians into sleeper weapons. And Joker tries to break Jim Gordon's mind to prove a point. But the Doomsday Experiment is worse because the entire process is built on repeated death. Doomsday first appeared as a cameo in Superman. The Man of Steel, #17 in November 1992, then made his first full appearance in Superman. The Man of Steel, #18 in December 1992. He was created during the build-up to the death of Superman, the massive 1992 storyline where DC introduced a creature powerful enough to do what almost no villain had done before, beat Superman to death in Superman #75. That already gives Doomsday a legendary place in DC history, but the battle with Superman is not what makes him the most disturbing experiment. The real horror comes from Superman/Doomsday, Hunter/Prey, the 1994 miniseries that explains where he came from. Before he was called Doomsday, he was known as the Ultimate. He was created on prehistoric Krypton, long before the Krypton of Jor-El, Lara, Kandor, the Science Council, and the House of El. This was not the polished Crystal Planet fans usually imagine when they think about Superman's homeworld. This was ancient Krypton, roughly 250,000 years before modern Kryptonian civilization became dominant. The planet was described as a nightmare environment, full of lethal conditions, brutal predators, extreme temperatures, and an atmosphere hostile enough that survival itself was almost impossible. That is the world Bertrand chose for his experiment. Bertrand was the alien scientist responsible for creating the Ultimate. His goal was not to create a child, a person, or even a soldier in the normal sense. His goal was to create the perfect living organism through artificial accelerated evolution. Instead of waiting for nature to select the strongest life form over millions of years, Bertrand tried to force the process inside a lab. The method was unbelievably cruel. He created a humanoid infant in vitro, released that infant onto the surface of prehistoric Krypton, and let the planet kill it. Then Bertrand collected the remains. That is where the experiment becomes even worse. The dead infant's surviving genetic material was used to clone a new version. That new version was released onto the surface again. It survived slightly longer, then died. Its remains were collected again. Another clone was created. That clone was sent out again. Then another. Then another. This cycle continued over and over for decades. That means the Doomsday Experiment was not one act of cruelty. It was an industrial routine of infant death, genetic recovery, cloning, and repeated exposure to lethal conditions. Every failure was not treated as a tragedy. It was treated as useful data, and every corpse became the next draft. Bertrand did not accidentally create suffering. Suffering was the mechanism. The subject had to die for the experiment to continue. The environment had to kill him. The predators had to tear him apart. And the atmosphere had to destroy him. Every death taught the next body what to survive. Eventually, the creature became strong enough to withstand the environment. Then it became strong enough to survive the predators, and strong enough to kill them. Over time, the thing Bertrand kept throwing into Krypton's death world became too durable, too adaptive, and too violent to control. and the psychological result was just as horrific as the physical one. The repeated deaths were not cleanly erased. The agony became part of the creature's instincts. Doomsday's hatred of life is not just random rage. It is the product of being created through murder again and again until violence becomes a biological memory. He does not just fight because he is aggressive. He fights because his entire existence was programmed through pain, death, and survival. That is why Doomsday feels different from a normal Superman villain. Lex Luthor hates Superman because of ego. Brainiac is driven by control and collection. Darkseid is a god of tyranny. Zod is shaped by Kryptonian militarism. But Doomsday is not motivated by ideology, pride, conquest, or revenge in the normal way. He is the result of an experiment that removed every possibility except survival and violence. He was never given a name at birth, a childhood, morality, and even given the dignity of being treated as alive in a meaningful way. He was a biological sample that Bertrand kept killing until the sample became unkillable. And the first proof of Bertrand's failure is perfect. Doomsday eventually kills his creator. The scientist who tried to manufacture the perfect survivor becomes one of the victims of the survival instinct he created. Bertrand wanted to control evolution, but what he actually built was a creature whose entire biology rejected control. The experiment succeeds scientifically and fails morally at the exact same time. Then, centuries later, Doomsday reaches Earth. In the death of Superman, he does not arrive with speeches, demands, or a plan. He breaks free and begins moving across America like a natural disaster with fists. He tears through the Justice League, including heroes like Booster Gold, Blue Beetle, Guy Gardner, Fire, Ice, Bloodwind, and Maxima. He does not need weapons. He is the weapon. By the time Superman stops him, the fight has escalated into one of the most famous battles in comic history. The final confrontation ends with both Superman and Doomsday collapsing from their injuries. Superman dies in Lois Lane's arms. Doomsday also falls. And that moment is only possible because Bertrand's experiment created something that could physically push Superman past the limit. The Doomsday experiment is worse because it creates a monster through a process where the test subject has to die again and again before he is even allowed to exist as the final product. Doomsday is not just a failed lab creation. He is what happens when a scientist turns death itself into a training program. Why DC's experiments are so disturbing. This is what makes this side of DC so disturbing. It is not just the monsters, the weapons, or the disasters that come out of these experiments. It is the mindset behind them. Because once you look closely at these stories, you start to notice that the most dangerous people in DC are not always the ones throwing planets, invading Earth, or trying to rule the universe. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones standing behind glass, taking notes, watching the results, and convincing themselves that the suffering in front of them is necessary. They are not always built from simple hatred. A lot of them come from ego, obsession, fear, control, or the belief that one person has the right to decide what another person should become. And that is where the line gets crossed. The moment a living being becomes a sample, a weapon, a product, or a proof of concept, the experiment has already become something darker than science. DC has always been good at showing that intelligence without morality is terrifying. A genius can build something incredible, but if that genius has no restraint, no empathy, and no respect for the person being experimented on, that brilliance becomes just another form of violence. That is why these stories work so well in a comic book universe. DC is filled with impossible beings. Superman can move at impossible speeds and survive things no human could survive. Batman can outthink enemies who should be far beyond him. The Justice League fights gods, aliens, cosmic tyrants, and reality-level threats. But then DC turns around and reminds you that horror does not always need to be cosmic. Sometimes, horror is one locked room, one test subject, one injection, one file, one machine, or one person who refuses to stop. When a villain destroys a city, everyone knows it is evil. But when someone calls their cruelty research, security, evolution, improvement, or protection, the evil becomes easier to hide. They show how easily a terrible idea can sound reasonable when the person explaining it is smart enough, powerful enough, or trusted enough. Some victims lose control of their bodies. And even when the hero wins, even when the monster is stopped, the damage does not always disappear. That is the part that separates the darkest DC experiments from ordinary villain schemes. The aftermath lasts. These experiments are not just side plots or origin details. They reveal some of the ugliest truths inside the DC universe. So what do you think is the most disturbing experiment in DC history? Which one crossed the line the worst? And which experiment do you think deserves its own full breakdown? Let me know your pick in the comments. And if you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into the darker side of comics, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos like this.